All right, hi everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for those in person and thanks for those tuning in virtually. This will also be recorded so we can distribute that to you as well. So the purpose of this event is to make graduate school more accessible. So if you were to go onto a school's website right now and look at the information about applying, you would not see all the information that we're telling you today. And if it weren't for other graduate students that I talked to while applying, I definitely wouldn't be here in a graduate program. So I think that information is very valuable, and we're happy to answer questions you have. The format for today is we have some pre-prepared questions and questions that came in through the Google form, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a discussion. All right, and
Yeah, so we'll just go ahead and quick do introductions. So I'm going to be the moderator this evening. My name's Sam Silknetter. I'm a third-year PhD candidate with Merrill Mims in the Department of Biological Sciences. I study aquatic insects and sort of stream ecology and a little bit of landscape genetics. I did my master's at Clemson University, and like I said, now I'm in a PhD program here.
So hi, my name is Amber Wendler, and I'm a third-year PhD student. We're all in the Biological Sciences department. I'm working with Ignacio Moore and Jeff Walters, and I study bird behavior in Puerto Rico.
Hi. I'm Corin Jones. I am a fourth-year PhD student. I'm in Lisa Belden's lab, and I study. Does this do anything?
I think you have to hold it pretty close.
All right, so it's not. I study frog bacteria, so trying to figure out how we can put specific bacteria on the skin of frogs for a reason.
I'm Brian Ruther. I am a second-year master's student, and I study with Dorothea Toll, and I look at the chemical ecology of the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive plant hopper.
Hi, I'm Megan Sweet. I work with Daniela Cimini, and I study centrosome number and tetraploidy in cells and trying to decide how different factors in a tumor microenvironment affect centrosome number in those tetraploid cells.
Hello, I'm Marissa, and I'm in Dana Hawley's lab, and we study disease ecology in house finches, which are a little songbird that you might see flying around here. And they get infected with this disease that basically causes them to have pink eye. So we look at the different dynamics of disease within this system.
Howdy, I'm Jesse Janowski. I'm a third-year PhD student in Carla Finkelstein's lab, not the COVID lab, her research lab. And I study the intersection of cancer and the circadian clock. And I also did my undergrad here at Tech and graduated in 2018.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So as Amber said, we've got some sort of pre-prepared questions. So I'll direct these to our different panelists. So the first question that we got, how do you know whether to apply for a master's or a PhD degree? And Marissa, we'll have you start.
So I forgot to say I'm a fourth year PhD student. And so there's a lot of personal choice that goes into whether you want to do a master's or a PhD. For me, I did not come into my grad career directly out of undergrad. I took 4 years off between getting my bachelor's and starting graduate school. And I chose to work and kind of, first of all, gain money so that I didn't destitute myself in graduate school, and also gain research experience. So I had some undergrad research experience, but I really wasn't quite sure what I would even want to do if I went into grad school. So I decided to take some time and really work and figure out what questions most interest me so that when I did get into grad school, I wasn't kind of like blind to my interests, and so I wasn't miserable. Because graduate school is really hard, so you don't want to come into it with kind of like, I could like this thing, and you will probably, if you do that, you'll probably be miserable if you find out you don't like it. So I came in with a lot of research experience, and I chose to do a PhD because of that. I was also a little older when I came in, and that helped, but age doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. And another thing is to think about the kind of jobs you're interested in having. So I'm really interested in teaching at a primarily undergrad university, or engaging with undergrads in some way, and a lot of those jobs require a PhD. So, but if you're, for instance, interested in doing a lot of field-based stuff, having a PhD can actually kind of take you out of the running for those kinds of jobs, whereas a master's will like boost you up. So just thinking about where you want your life to go and kind of what your experiences are and what you're really interested, and talking to other people who have done the different routes, who have either gotten a master's and been happy with that, or gotten a PhD and been happy with that, can be really clarifying.
So we'll ask the same question to Corin. And again, it's how do you know, of course, these lights.
Yeah.
Hold on one. Yep. Sorry, friends, we were warned.
There we go. We got it.
So,
All right. Everything that Marissa said was great, right? But one of those things that I kind of want to focus in on is like, how much time do you have is something that's important, and like, what do you want to do with that time, right? So a perfectly reasonable trajectory that you could do is you graduate immediately from undergrad, you join a PhD program, and then you get your degree. You'll be very young, and you can start your career that way. Now, there are a lot of benefits to that, and that you'll actually be able to do research for an extended period of time. Schools are usually happier to have like younger faculty because they know they'll stick around for a lot longer. But being like a professor, if you choose to go in academia, but being just a doctor is kind of like a serious job in that they expect you to continue working basically from the time that you get it, rather than like falling behind on research or something. And so there's not a lot of like free time to just sort of explore who you are or who you want to be. And so I would recommend, just in general, taking a break after undergrad and just sort of working, or doing a master's, which is a shorter program that will then allow you to get a bunch of other jobs and then go out and sort of explore how that whole thing works. Because like she said, having a job in mind is important, because a PhD will lock you out of certain jobs, whereas a master's won't necessarily do that. And so it'll provide you a bit more time. Now, I jumped straight into a PhD program, but I also took 7 years off from undergrad. I lived in China for a while. I went around like Southeast Asia. I moved to Utah for like a short period. And I had a lot of time to sort of think about where I wanted my life to go and what I wanted to do. So when it came time to like dedicate my life to science, if you will, then I knew that that was actually something that I wanted to do. I had pretty clear career goals that I needed to accomplish with this whole program thing. So just like sort of knowing what your timeline is and then what your goals are will sort of dictate which one of those programs is going to fit you a little bit better.
awesome. Thank you, Corin.
One thing on that is that there's like no like right trajectory to have for your career. Thank you. Yeah, so there's no right trajectory, so there's no like correct path that you can take. Like Corin took 7 years off. My mom just got her master's and she's in her 50s. So like there's no problem with taking time and figuring it out. And there's also no, like, I feel like classically it's like, well, you get a bachelor's and then you get a master's and then you get a PhD. But there's a lot of different ways you can do that, path. So don't feel like honed in on this one path that's correct, because there's no such thing.
Awesome. So we'll go to Amber, who's just going to kind of walk you through sort of this process of actually applying to graduate school.
Yeah, so we're going to go into each of these components in more detail in the following questions. So I'll just keep it brief. I just wanted to give you a brief overview to set up the next questions. So of course, first you're going to do some research online, search through different schools and programs depending on what you're interested in. So I was going through all the biology departments and looking at their faculty lists and seeing if there's any faculty that I would be interested in working with. Did they share my research interests? And so Many graduate programs, at least for biology, require you to identify a potential advisor ahead of time. Not all programs do, and some have these rotations, which we'll explain in a bit. So yeah, go through those lists and see if there's anyone you'd be interested in working with. Send them an email explaining who you are, what you're interested in, and also see if they're accepting students or have funding available for you. And then also you want to make sure that you meet the requirements for the program. So some schools have a GPA requirement, and also some programs have a GRE requirement. Many schools are actually dropping the GRE requirement, which is really great. The Virginia Tech Biology Department did that a couple years ago as well. And then typically, this is not the case for all programs, but they will have the application deadline toward the end of the year. So Virginia Tech, the deadline, I believe, is in December. And then typically there are fees associated with this, but something that I didn't realize at the time that I wish I knew about are that apparently fee waivers aren't as difficult to get as I thought. So if, you don't want to have to pay to apply to a bunch of schools, definitely doesn't hurt to just contact them and ask if you can have a fee waiver. And then if, they think you're a good candidate, they'll invite you for an interview weekend. And usually this is all paid expenses, which is nice. I'm not sure how things may have changed now with the Zoom and stuff, but typically this was in person, and then they would let you know shortly after if you're accepted into the program.
So we're going to go to Jesse next for this next question. And so the question is, it's pretty broad. How do you select an advisor? And so, the first question, it's sort of for you, Jesse, is how does that look different entering in lab rotations versus just joining a lab individually? And so just some context for all of you. A lot of times there can be different job boards and you're applying to a specific position with a specific advisor. And so I know for me, that was the case. But in other instances, we've got rotations. So if you want to be able to speak to that, Jesse.
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of a unique situation because I've actually done both. You might be wondering, how is that possible? Well, like I said, I graduated from Tech in 2018, and I had applied to grad schools during my senior year, as most people do. And I had decided to go to the University of Notre Dame. And that program was a molecular biology program, and they do rotations. But unfortunately, my particular year, they had over-accepted first-year students. And so there was way more people vying for positions in labs than there were lab spaces. So because of this, I realized that, hey, none of the labs I'm interested in are going to be able to take me. So I reached out to Carla, who I had worked with in undergrad, and also she had ironically written me a letter of recommendation for graduate school, and was kind of like, hey, how do you suggest I navigate this? I'm not sure what to do. It's not a very good situation. And she was like, well, hey, I just finished interviewing our incoming cohort, and I didn't really find anyone I would like to take. So if you would like to return to Virginia Tech, I'd be happy to take you into my lab. So I submitted the entire application in a day in April and for the fall semester. And to give you some context, usually grad school applications are due by December at the latest. And so I was accepted, and I went back and I joined directly into her lab, and that's what I've been working on for the past 3 years. But I will say that even though I kind of had a bad experience with the rotation setup, that I think there is a benefit to the overall idea behind them, in the sense that you essentially get to trial run a lab. And I would strongly suggest, when you're identifying programs and schools to apply to, like Amber was saying, reach out to potential advisors and ask them if they would be happy to have you rotate, and whether or not they're interested in having someone join their lab. Because I will say, if when you need to choose labs to rotate in, you need to make sure that they're labs that are actually accepting people into their lab, because some PIs will let you rotate but not really have any intention of having someone join their lab. Which, if you're upfront about that, that's great, because sometimes you can learn a new technique, or you can learn just a different area of interest. But in terms of identifying a permanent lab, I would strongly suggest that you're very upfront about having a frank conversation with the advisor, being like, hey, are you really interested in having someone join? And the length of the rotation varies from program to program. At Notre Dame, it was about a month-long rotation. Usually you complete 3 to 4 rotations before you have to decide. And that's essentially like your whole first year is basically deciding which lab you're going to join. So that's kind of one, I would say, downside to rotations is you do kind of like, quote unquote, lose a year, but it is kind of a valuable experience in the sense that you get to experience like the lab culture and environment of many different advisors. And everyone has their own preference and mentoring style and things like that. So I really enjoyed it, even though, you know, it didn't end up working out for me in terms of the rotations, but obviously the situation resolved itself. So I think, you know, it's kind of personal preference, but I will say I think it varies somewhat by field too. I think ecology tends to do direct admissions more than molecular biology. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but Amber, do you have any idea? I know you're in ecology, that's why I'm calling you out on that.
Do I know why that is?
Why that they usually direct admit more?
I'm not sure why.
Well, I can give some.
Yeah, do you want to
I think a lot of it has to do with like specific skill sets that are associated with studying maybe like specific organisms. So all my experiences with working with birds. So that could be a major reason. It also could just be historically. That's how it's been done. And there's a lot of things in academia that are done like that, where it's like, well, that's how it's always been. But I think a lot of it has to do with dealing with like specific organisms or specific types of questions, and where maybe molecular actually has a little more freedom to, there's like a lot more applicability across tests and stuff like that.
So actually, Marissa, we'll stick with you. And so the question still is, how do you select an advisor? But focusing on sort of the research interest and mentoring style of a potential PI.
Yeah, so like I kind of talked about, you really want to come into grad school with at least a basic idea of what your interests are. Even a master's, that's a long time to be doing something that you hate. And you're going to be reading really deeply into your research topics, so even something that you don't find interesting is still painful. So when I came into my lab, I had never worked with diseases, no idea anything disease-wise, but I was very interested in physiology and behavior and kind of the integrative approach that my PI took. So kind of combining like many facets of the bird's ecology or life history in order to answer questions. And because that's really what I was interested in, she was a good fit for me. Another thing that is really important that is completely unrelated to research interest, but is kind of was even more important for me at the time, was that I really wanted to be advised by a woman. That was really important to me. And if something like that is important to you, then that's not like dumb or lame, or that's something that you should really focus on. It's okay to want to be advised by a certain person, you know? And so when you meet with advisors, or when you're looking at advisors, you have to think about not only do your research interests align with theirs, even if they're not like a direct like one-to-one comparison, but also do their personalities, when you meet with them, do you get any red flags? Do they mesh with you? And you also, I think we're going to talk about this later, but you also want to talk to their current grad students about how their personality comes across, because all of those three things together can really contribute to figuring out who's the best fit for you. And it's always okay, because more often than not, you are going to be applying to multiple programs. It's okay to not mesh with someone and to tell them, like, no, I'm not interested in taking this position, even if it is the only position that you are like offered. If you get red flags on any one, like research interests, their grad students give you bad input, or their personality doesn't mesh with yours, it's okay to say no and try again. That would be my biggest suggestion, is don't like push through those red flags, trust your gut. Yeah, because that you're going to be working super closely with this person for, if you're doing a master's, 2 to 3 years, and if you're doing a PhD, anywhere from 4+ years. So just think about all of that, like working very closely with someone for that long.
Yeah, so Brian, we'll go to you next, and to, again, how do you select an advisor, but talked about that, sort of talking to current and former graduate students in that lab.
Yeah, I'll give you guys an anecdote. So like, when I graduated from college, I joined this like, wasn't really a post-bac program. It was just I joined a lab as an undergraduate research assistant, and I worked with a PI, and he had a couple of grad students and a technician. And you know, me and the grad students got along really well, but almost every chance we got when we were, you know, out doing field work alone from the PI, the grad students or the technician would rag on the PI and how, you know, impatient he was and just how hard he was to work with. And I was like, you know, how did you guys get here if this guy is so awful? And it turns out he really liked this one grad student that he had a couple of years ago before I got there. And so based on her opinion, he was great, but no one else, I guess, you know, got up to her expectations. So his next graduate students were, you know, miserable. So I really want to emphasize, like, talk to the people in the PI's lab that you are interested in and make sure they're honest with you. Don't just be like, or don't just let them be like, oh yeah, they're fine. You know, like really drill them. And I'm really happy with the PI I ended up with, and I was sort of aggressive in my questioning, and turns out I didn't have to be because she's great, but you know, I definitely implore you to do that.
That's awesome. And I guess I'll add one quick thing to that, is that, you know, also for some of you, you may find an advisor that has just started. And if they're a new PI, you know, there are definite pros and definite cons with that. So like, you don't have students that you can talk to. Like maybe you could potentially talk to people that they worked with as a postdoc or something. But also, if you ever have professors that you take classes with that are young faculty, they oftentimes are better lecturers, they're more engaged, they're more motivated. And so all of those things can also sort of bleed into their mentoring style. So just definitely have that frank conversation with them, even if there aren't potentially students that you can ask.
Also, man, don't get like too starstruck either. So like, there's this thing where you find this professor and they do this research that's just like so great, and they get all these grants and they're doing all of this stuff, but like they can be terrible people, right? Just because you're good at science doesn't mean that you're a good person. And even if they're not terrible, they might be too busy, right? If you join a lab where they have like 10, 15 grad students, which is a thing that happens in places, then you might not be getting the attention that you necessarily want. So that's just another one of those things to consider, is like the status of the PI as well, whether that actually transfers into like good mentoring, and then what that size of that lab looks like, if that's something that you like.
Awesome. Corin, we'll stick with you. So the next question, how did you decide which graduate program was right for you, and what are some important things to look for?
This is one of my favorite stories. So I'm from Virginia. I grew up in Virginia Beach, and I constantly heard about Virginia Tech, which I didn't really like. It was a school that I just wasn't a fan of. I didn't like the color scheme. I didn't like how big it was. I didn't like the hokey thing. It was a lot of stuff that I didn't enjoy, right? And so I instead went to this small liberal arts college, which I thought was great. I got a lot more attention there, which is what I think I needed. But even people there were still sort of like caught up in this whole hokey mindset thing. So again, just irritating to me. Fast forward a lot of years and a lot of places that I've lived, and I'm looking for graduate programs. And I come across the lab of my advisor, which focuses on frogs, a thing I've loved since I could say frog, really. And then bacteria, this thing that I've been like super interested in for a while. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this was an option to like combine those things together. So I was like, it is at Virginia Tech though, and like maybe I can get over it. So like I talked to her, and the conversation that we had was like great. It was a phone call, and it had been like 30 minutes to an hour, like past when like the normal, what do you like to study and what are your research plans? And it was just sort of a conversation, which made me feel like very comfortable and appreciated, I guess. So anyway, I receive an email that's like, we'd like to invite you to the weekend where you can come down. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever. And so I get here, and it has this like almost culty atmosphere. However, it's genuine for the most part. Like, so the grad students that I talked to, right? I of course wanted to know what was going on and whether they were like happy, because if you look anywhere on the internet, like just go to the internet, go on a forum about grad school or whatever, it's terrible, you're depressed, it's hard. That's what people say. Right? Like that's always the thing, right? And so I'm talking to these people, and they're like super cheery and they're excited, and I'm like, well, this is weird. You know, they're just trying to like recruit me in or something. Like, I'm not really sure what's going on. And like the research day, the thing that we like do here is like it's an all-day event, and all day these people are acting the same, right? You're like, oh, you should be tired now, or you know, maybe like your happy attitude thing is probably going to be like a little bit played out or whatever. It was not. It continued. We went out afterwards, we went to like one of the bars and hung out. People are now drunk, and I'm like, all right, great. This is where I'm gonna get like the actual information, right? But it wasn't, they were like genuinely happy. And the experience that I had with my advisor was like perfect. She was amazing, she was funny, the people in the lab really liked her, and again, were genuinely happy with themselves. One of them being somebody who was about to graduate, like it was his 5th year and he was gonna defend that summer. And then the other one was someone who was in their 4th year. And again, not defeated, not like, oh, I can't believe that, you know, I'm almost like, it wasn't that. It was just like, I'm happy, it is challenging sometimes, but like, you know, I'm in pretty good spirits. Then I went to another school, which I'm not gonna name, but I visited there, and there was a very different air from the grad students in that environment. And this other program is like, on paper, maybe a little bit better in terms of like, getting a job immediately, right? It was a field that's like always gonna be necessary. They have a lot of like networking things that they'll help you get a job basically as soon as you graduate. So it's one of those like, oh, I could do this. It was also shorter, right? So they were like, yeah, you could definitely do it in like 4 years. You might even be able to finish it in like 3.5. And I was like, oh, and then I get a job, and it's just that, the cost of living was low. But like everybody in that program was so stressed out, and they were just sort of like sad, you know, like an overwhelming feeling of like, things could be better. Like, I can't wait till this is over. I can't wait till I get to the next step or whatever. And while there are people here that certainly feel that way, right? It's not like everyone is happy all the time or anything. But there's a lot more of this like happier community sort of thing. And as much as we talk about how important the advisor fit is, you're building a network of like peers that are there to support you in your rough times or whatever. Like, you want to have friends, right? You don't want to be completely isolated. So the attitudes that the people around you have are also going to be important. The location is also going to be important. If you're somebody that hates small towns, then maybe don't go to a school that's in a small town, because that is probably going to wear on you after a while, right? If you don't like big cities, don't go to a school that's in a big city. So these are all things that you have to consider. But I would really think about like how you feel when you're there visiting. Are the emotions that you're getting from other people genuine? And do you think that you're going to be able to survive in that place for like 5 years? I've had a great time. If you were to ask me like, does grad school suck? I'd say no, it's great, it's fun. I've had a lot of fun, met a lot of people. Like, I love it. Like, it's fantastic. So
COVID wasn't great.
Well,
It's not great.
it wasn't, but I had a lot of support during this thing. So like, COVID basically ruined most people's year to 2-year periods, right? Because you can't do the work that you're supposed to do. Your plans have been like thrown out completely, basically. But I had support here, both from people around me, but then also from like my advisor, and then like some degree from like the rest of like the school. So like, even that, which should have been something that's like terrible, it was fun. Was it the best? No. But it was fun, which is like kind of all you can expect from a global pandemic, right?
We're gonna do the same question quick over to Jesse. And so again, how how'd you know the program was right for you? You sort of talked about this a little bit, but sort of what's important for you to look at, I guess.
Yeah, so I actually applied to 8 programs because I wasn't entirely sure of the research area I wanted to get into. There was so many that just felt interesting to me that I was like, well, I'll just apply to them all. And like Amber was mentioning with the fee waivers, a lot of them did not have a fee to apply. So I was like, well, I'm already filling out so many applications. Why not just, go big or go home? So I ended up getting accepted to 6 of those schools, which meant that I went to 6 interview weekends, which I do not recommend because it's extremely overwhelming when you're, taking your senior classes. And I had a part-time job and I was in a fraternity. I was way overworked. But my point being is that the interview weekend, like Corin mentioned, I think is really the best chance to kind of get a sense of the vibe and whether or not you can picture yourself being happy there for the next 4 to 5, maybe 6 years. I will say there were some schools where maybe the program, like Corey was mentioning, the program on paper was significantly better than some of the others. But for example, at one school, I remember at the reception dinner, so like usually, everyone's flying in from wherever they're coming from, and they have like kind of a welcome dinner event. This was kind of a common theme at a lot of the interview weekends. And I remember at this dinner specifically, this grad student pulled me aside and was like, hey, I just want to let you know if you're going to come here, it's going to be hell. And, we're all miserable here. We're all trying to get out. And at the time I was like, whoa, this is kind of weird. Like I've never had someone be just, so blunt about it. And I thought maybe it was just an odd quirk or something. But then as time went on, I really appreciated the fact that, she kind of went out of her way to be like, hey, don't come here. Because, the interview weekend is kind of artificially created because, they try to make sure that it's a good experience. They try to, ask for volunteers who are excited to talk about their research and their experience. So it's a little bit of a biased view or perspective. But I think if you can kind of talk to people who maybe aren't directly involved in admissions or aren't directly involved in like the recruitment weekend, they're going to be more likely to be honest with you than someone who is specifically, volunteered or chosen to speak to recruitment students. So that was kind of the thing for me. And then also just, like others have mentioned, the location was a factor for me. I really liked the University of Southern California. That was originally my top choice, and that was the best choice on paper. But when I got down to it and thinking about the stipend, the cost of living in California, sky high, and I didn't really want to be living in a shoebox with 9 roommates and, eating ramen every night. So really look at, what that program's offering, what they're guaranteeing in terms of funding, because that's really going to impact a lot of your experience in terms of like life outside of lab, which does exist, by the way. But it just really trust your gut. And if you have a bad feeling about something and you can't really pinpoint why, I would just avoid it because oftentimes it is a real reason behind it. So
awesome. So and you actually brought up funding, so we'll go to Megan now. And so I think one of the questions that people often wonder, sort of what is funding like for graduate students? And so if you want to first talk about sort of like RAs as a master's student.
Yeah. So I am a first year master's student, so I really just got here in August, so I haven't been here that long. And I actually am on a graduate research assistantship. And so that means there's graduate teaching assistantships and research assistantships. For a TA, you teach an undergrad coursework and you get your stipend that way. But for me, I get my money by doing research in the lab that I am in. So I work with my PI and I have my project that is going to be just my master's thesis project. And that is what I work on to get this funding. And there is a set number of hours that you have to technically work for to get this amount of money, which is about $26,000 a year. And you work most of the time over that allotted amount of time. For me, it's about 25 hours, but I'm here 9 to 5, except when I have classwork, which is like 10 hours a week. And I'm in the lab working and doing my thing so I can progress within my research. So honestly, it doesn't feel like a job to me because I came here because I like to do research and I wanted to get my experience as a master's student and be able to decide if I want to do a PhD further down the road. And so for me, it's not like a job atmosphere. It's more of like I am working towards what I want, but I'm getting money while doing it.
Awesome. So we'll go to Marissa. And so to speak about sort of being a teaching assistant, but also sort of the master's versus PhD. And just one thing to clarify, I know I said it earlier, PI is a principal investigator. So like a PI is just the professor that you're working with. So like, you know, that's whoever sort of runs the lab.
Yeah, jargon. So I am, like I said, I'm a PhD student. I'm actually what's called a candidate, which means that I have passed my preliminary exams, which is an exam that you take when you're a PhD student. Anyways, you don't have to worry about that now. So I get a like little pay bump, whether I'm TAing or RAing. So it's not really anything. It's like $50, yeah. But that's something that to like consider once you do get past that point. So my TA-RA schedule is that I, like Megan, in the fall, I am on a research assistantship, and in the spring, I TA, and I TA ornithology, which is a great course. Everyone should take it. And so for my RA, I'm not working on a project that is going to be a part of my dissertation. My dissertation is separate from what I'm working on. It's more of funding that my PI has gotten through a grant. So I'm working on the project associated with that grant. But for TAing, the contract that we're under is 20 hours a week for the teaching part, and then the other part of your week, like Megan said, we don't just work 20 hours a week, we work a full work week. The other 20 is for your research. And so when you're teaching, there's a lot of options that you can teach for. A lot of people here teach for general biology, or what is it called? Principles of biology. Yeah, so, but the pricing, or the pricing, the amount we get paid is the same whether you are an RA or a GTA. And that, I think that's set by the department usually, so that like people who are only on TAs aren't, don't get less than people on RAs. Just lost my train of thought. That's fine. Yeah, and so, oh yeah, here it is. Got it. PhD versus master's. So at Virginia Tech, there's no real pay difference between whether you are a PhD or a master's as far as when you're TAing. I can't speak for individual lab PIs, but this is not the case at every institution. In some places, master students actually get paid less, which is, in my opinion, not fair, but that's another thing in academia that's more like historical and bit like, well, they're here for less time, blah, blah, blah. I don't agree with it, but it is the case. And one thing that Jesse and Corin mentioned is when you are looking at programs and how much they fund, and by the way, it is totally okay to ask your prospective PI when you're interviewing what your stipend will be. That is how you are going to make your livelihood. You're not going to have, and especially in sciences, you are not going to have time to have a second job to fund. So it's totally okay to ask that information, and I highly suggest you do. But yeah, so you want to look at things like how much it costs to live in a place, like, do you need to pay for health benefits as well? So just when you're thinking about funding, it's not just like how much do I get paid? It's all these extra little things that you have to add on. So just really consider that when you're talking to your PI.
Yeah, sure.
So for me, when I was applying and I was trying to figure out my funding issues and what was going to happen, I, rather than spoke to the PI just solely about funding, I asked them, what is the funding like? But then I went to the graduate students and I said, hey, what is cost of living like? How sustainable is this life that you're living? Do you have money for groceries? like what areas are good for me to live in if I wanted to have more money or less money and things like that. So talking to the graduate students who actually live on this pay, because your PIs don't live on the pay that you're going to get paid. And so talking to them gives you a really like one-on-one insight about how you will be living rather than how your PI thinks you will be living.
One more thing. When you're looking at programs for the stipends in general, make sure that if it's a lab that does like crossover stuff, to check both programs. So there was a school that I was looking at, and the umbrella program that they had, which was for like molecular research, there were 2 labs that were in there that I liked that were also in the ecology department. But if you went through the ecology department, you got paid $25,000 a year. If you went through the umbrella rotation, you got paid $28,000 a year. But it was the same lab with the same PIs and the same research. So just make sure that you're like checking out all of the angles to make sure that you're getting like the best salary that you possibly could.
That's a great point. And also like those sort of dynamics can also, like you can imagine how that can become toxic with different people if you're getting paid different amounts for the same amount of work. So just another thing to consider. So we did have some stuff about fellowships and different funding, but we're going to skip ahead and we can circle back to that a little bit later. We want to make sure you all have time to ask questions. But so Corin, we'll go to you. What can you do to sort of be a competitive applicant? Yeah.
Okay. When you're applying to grad school, one of the obvious things that people are going to look for is your research experience. I had virtually none. So I did a lot of other stuff, and that sort of is like important to spin. So like, not to sound cliche or whatever, but your life is important. The things that you've done are important, and you have a lot of skills that are in like different areas that you might not necessarily realize. So like, when I moved to China, I taught for 5 years, which is like not something that a lot of other grad students have experience in, like not teaching that long. So even though like my research portfolio is pretty small, my teaching portfolio was actually pretty big. And when I moved back to the States, there was like more teaching. There was some stuff that was like lab stuff, but none of it was research. Didn't do any research. Very little research has been done. But figuring out how to leverage all of the stuff that you're actually good at is going to be really important for being a competitive applicant. So don't necessarily think that like, oh, because I haven't had like 4 years of research experience that I can't get into something like that. Another thing that helped me a lot is looking forward, right? So I know that you're unfamiliar with like how everything works, because how could you possibly be, right? But looking for grants and things and bringing that up, especially in these like interviews or these initial emails that you're sending out, is going to signal to that person that you are dedicated to doing this, and that even that you don't necessarily have like the strongest background, you're clearly trying to do something to get to that point. And that's actually going to carry a lot of weight. So just think about how great you are, and then try to turn that into a benefit and just write that down. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. So we'll go to Brian next. And so the question is, how can you increase your chances of getting in if your GPA isn't the best?
Yeah. Let's see. I started off my first semester of freshman year in college with a 2.87, and then I got up to a 3.44, and then but my bio GPA was always at like a solid 3, and my advisor was like, that's not that great. And I was like, oh man. But to sort of boost that, I took a year off because I was really adamant about going right into grad school from undergrad, and I didn't really think about why. I just kind of wanted to. She was like, you don't have to do that. You can, get a job. You can get multiple jobs, and your GPA isn't going to change, but your experiences will. So yeah, go do whatever you want, whether it's teaching or I don't know. Maybe if you need to make money in the interview process, say like I got a job where I can make a lot of money, so I delivered pizzas, and then after that I tried getting a job at a public health lab or something. Like really just building up your experiences is one critical thing to do if your grades aren't the best. And honestly, I think like people that get 4.0s aren't even the best researchers. Like I had a teacher that was always claiming that the B average students, they're the best researchers. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with all that, but it doesn't matter that much. It's what are you going to do in grad school or like what you prepared to do before getting into grad school is what matters.
We'll go to the same question for Megan.
Going off of what Brian just said about the B average students, I was a B average student. And he said that people say that B average students are the best researchers. I can see how that is the case because a lot of research is not coursework. You don't sit and take classes every day like you do in undergrad. A lot of it is independent research and inquisitive thought and where can I take this project next? What do I need to do to figure out this next step and things of that sort. So graduate school is not the same as undergraduate in the sense that you were in classes all the time. And it's just like bouncing off of that, graduate schools want a diverse population of students that come to their school. And so they don't look for kids that have this 4.0 GPA. They look for kids that can bring something in terms of teaching, or they have this cultural background, or they have these hobbies and interests. And there's a lot of different things that you can do to boost just your overall application. It's not just GPA. And there's just so many, everything that you do can almost be turned into a positive thing. And you can take that and run with it and either write about it in your personal statement or explain it in your interviews, and how this will provide a diverse cohort within what school you go to.
Awesome. Well, actually, Megan, we'll stick with you. And so this will be our last sort of the canned questions. Sort of what is day-to-day life of a graduate student like, and what do you enjoy the most?
Yeah. So for me, I am actually in a wet lab. A lot of you guys are ecologists, and that's a little bit different from my work. I work at a bench a lot of the times, that I work with cells and things of that sort. I am a first year, and one of the things that is very heavy as you come in is reading and getting acquainted with your literature and what you're working on in your project. And so for me, when I'm not doing my bench work, I am reading. And it's not a bad thing, because as you move forward, that reading will lessen, because you'll know the background of the information you're studying, but you will have to continue to read to progress your project. But a lot of it, this background reading, is overwhelming at first. For me, I am a little bit overwhelmed, but I just take it day by day, because I know that this is something that I will need to know. And I will need to have this knowledge to progress further within my research project. But as for wet lab work, that is probably my favorite part of my day-to-day thing, because it's what I'm here for. I have had 2 lab experiences before this, and I did wet lab work as well. And I knew that I enjoy working with cells, working with tissues and things of that sort. And so it's almost like a break from my reading and working. And also one thing that I really do love is the collaborative environment that is portrayed within at least my lab. We have a few undergrad students and a few graduate students, and we all work very well together. And we are able to communicate well, and even not about lab work, but just in general life. It just fosters a very supportive and collaborative environment, which helps me make me feel better about the little bit of stress that I am having getting acquainted to this new program and lifestyle.
Awesome. And then we'll go to Amber to wrap this one up. So again, just day-to-day life and sort of what you enjoy the most.
All right, cool. So I am an ecologist, and like many of my peers, we have field work to do. So how my schedule works is I'm actually down in Puerto Rico for 5 months out of the year doing field work. I just had my first field season this past year. So that's in the spring and summer. And so then in the fall, you'll have that time where you can analyze your data. So, a lot of sitting behind a computer, working with R, doing statistics and whatnot. And then also, I collect blood samples, so I'll be analyzing those in the lab as well. So it's a combination of field, lab, and computer stuff, which is cool. So you're not, doing the same thing. And then also for your first few years, you'll be taking courses. Each program is different, but the biology program here, the course requirement is pretty low. So I've just taken 2 courses a semester approximately. And then, of course, your whole life doesn't have to be grad school. So I try to I'm not always the best, but I try to have, work-life balance and do other activities that I care about as well. So, whether that's hanging out with friends or, maybe working on projects not necessarily related to my research, like DEI or science communication and outreach kind of projects. So yeah, and it really varies. It's, as a grad student, especially like a PhD student working on this long project, you're the one making your schedule and holding yourself accountable to do that work. So, some weeks, if you only work like 15 hours that week, like there may not, and depending on your advisor's style, there may not be someone coming to you and like asking you like what exactly you did. So it's like your job to like make sure that you're staying motivated and focused, and it just goes up and down. Then there might be weeks where you like make up for work that you didn't get done a previous week. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so we still have a couple of other questions, but we wanted to sort of turn it over to you. So if you guys want to raise your hand, if you guys have any specific questions, because there's obviously a lot here, and I think especially for you in the audience, like this is an opportunity. Like if you have specific questions, we want you to be able to get them answered. Feel free to think about it. We've got some others that I can ask. Yeah.
For going back to the stipends, what's like the average one, you would say?
So for those online, I don't know if you can hear that. So the question is about stipends and sort of basically like sort of what is the range of stipends that you'd expect to have?
Sure, I can start, and then if anyone wants to add anything. So we were saying like here in the bio department for like TIRA positions, it's about 26,000. And then we didn't really talk about fellowships, but there are a number of us who are on fellowships. And the National Science Foundation has a graduate research fellowship, and so you get paid more with that. That's $34,000, and that's for 3 years, where you don't have to teach or like be working on someone else's research project. So that's a really good opportunity. And Virginia Tech even has a whole workshop to help you apply for that. But I've heard of some people like we were talking about that make like 12,000, which is very low. I would not recommend going to a program where they're not, paying you a living wage. It just shows that they don't value their students. And also, I don't think it was mentioned, but there's actually some master's programs that are not funded. So you definitely want to be looking out for that. Typically all PhD programs are funded. I haven't heard of them not being. So if funding, is important to you, make sure you ask about that.
Yeah, and I think just one thing to add. So also sometimes your funding is only for 9 or 10 months out of the year, and you might have to come up with your own funding over the summer. And that's just sort of on you, and you can or you can split that lump sum, and just kind of string it out over the summer. I went to a different university for my master's, and that was $18,000 a year as a stipend. And I know PhD students got paid more there, but then I have friends that maybe made a little more than I did. But if you're at UC Berkeley, if you're at the University of Chicago, NYU, like that money's not going to go nearly as far. And that's, the 9 roommates in a 500 square foot flat. And so definitely something to consider. There's a huge range, for sure.
That made me think about something as well to consider when it comes to funding. So the money we're talking about right now that's just paying your salary. However, you also need to fund your actual research somehow. So when you're traveling or your equipment or whatever you need. So that's also an important question to ask. Like, does your advisor have grant funding for that? Or if they don't, it'll be on you to apply for small research grants like $1,000, $2,000 to fund your research. And then, I know some people that, use their own personal salary to help fund their research as well. So definitely something to consider.
We've been talking about stipends, just like livable salary wage, but one thing that I was looking for when I was applying was they give me a stipend and also pay my tuition. So here, they do cover most of my tuition. I'm an out-of-state student, so they cover that difference. And then they also basically cover everything except the comprehensive fees, which here is about $2,000 a semester. And so that money that I get from my stipend is what I use to live. I don't have to pay tuition with that. I don't have to pay scholarships or anything, or what are they called? What do you get from FAFSA? Loans. That's one thing that you don't really have to apply for if you feel comfortable living at the wage that they are going to give you. You don't have to worry about loans. You can just focus solely on your stipend that you get because they pay for your tuition and other things like that.
I have a quick add-on to that. You touched on a little bit the graduate fees. I would be on the lookout for this. With most programs have these, and the amount can widely vary. Like you were saying, it's about $2,000 a year here at Tech, and that's not factored into your salary. A lot of times you have to pay that directly. Some programs will offer kind of like a payment plan where you're not paying that lump sum up front, but I would definitely look into and consider that as part of, deducting that from your stipend, because it really can make a big difference. I mean, thankfully, in my case, I'm able to get away from some of it because they have a waiver if you don't live in Blacksburg, and our lab is located in Roanoke, and I live in Roanoke, so I'm not, participating in a lot of the things that the fees cover. So in that sense, I don't pay as much, but it's still a significant amount and something to think about when you're thinking about cost of living.
Yeah, and sorry, just one more thing to add is that I feel like sometimes, in high school, college, if you're applying for jobs, like it might feel inappropriate to sort of like ask questions about money. Like you don't want that to count against you. In graduate school, ask every one of those questions. If you think about something that you want the answer to, ask it. And if they're like unwilling to give it, like that's a potential red flag. And so I think it can sometimes be uncomfortable, but I think it's really important that you sort of know exactly what you're getting yourself into. And definitely feel free to talk to other students at that place. They're probably a really good resource for that.
You're not applying to be. Grad students are weird. So you are applying to be a student, but you are also not applying to be a student. It's a job, really, what you're doing. So if you're doing a job interview for like a more permanent position, you're going to ask like, how the heck much am I getting paid here? So it's totally appropriate. And I totally agree with what Sam said. If the PI won't answer or kind of hedges, then red flag, massive, because that's how you make your livelihood, like that's how you can have a life to do your work, sort of thing.
How's the public speaking aspect of graduate school?
So the question is, and we're laughing, but it's so, what is the public speaking aspect of graduate school? And so I think any one of us can take this. Corin seems excited.
I'm going to start and then you go. So I was always terrified of public speaking. And wow, grad school really just like kicks that out of you really quickly. It's a heavy part of it, especially in science. We need to be able to communicate what we're doing, whether that's to the public or to other scientists, or if that's a big part of it. So yeah, I know it's a part that's like so daunting, but it really just, practice does really make perfect in this scenario. It's, you stop getting nervous and it's like, well, I'm going to do good or I'm going to do bad. It's what it is.
Okay, y'all. So you're gonna have to do public speaking, right? It's like a requirement of this whole thing. It's actually like a requirement for the PhD program in biological sciences. You have to give like a talk. However, you don't necessarily have to be good at it to be a good scientist. But if you are good at it, it does make you look a little bit better than a lot of other people. Talks are like, that's how we communicate research, right? But the people that necessarily like research don't necessarily like people or talking or have any idea how to tell people about the stuff that they're doing. So it's actually like a really growing area of science, and like, I'm sure you've heard science communication, thrown up a lot. But like it's just communication, right? It's just talking to people. But because scientists have historically been so bad at it, we now have an entire category that is trying to figure out how scientists can talk to both other scientists and to normal people. So like, you'll get trained more in it if it's something that like you're nervous about or that you don't have a lot of experience in. But if you make that more of a priority, then a lot of the like difficulty that comes from that is going to be so much easier. Because you don't have to give the best talk. It just needs to be better than the terrible talks that other people have seen, all through that conference, or maybe at like all the seminars that year or something. And just like being a little bit different really helps you stand out. So like the public speaking, big part, work at it, and it's going to be so much easier. Anyone else?
One thing. Kind of a way that I got over my like fear of public speaking was thinking like, okay, I have these people and they are trapped in a room and they have to listen to me talk about something I love. So just like being really excited in that way, maybe not the trapping people in a room part, but you know, like these people are here to listen to me talk about something that I did and I'm excited about and I love, and kind of approaching it from like a positive perspective rather than being like, I'm gonna mess up, people aren't gonna like it, oh my gosh. Like that is kind of the natural human way to approach things. And I think just like totally flipping that on its head and being like, I'm freaking awesome. What I do is great. So yeah, that's like something to come into. And that's a mentality that I have learned as I have gone through grad school, not something that kind of is innate in me.
Yeah, and I think just a point on that, you know, and the same thing with the GPA is that it can be daunting. Like, I don't have a good GPA, I can't go to grad school. I don't feel confident public speaking, I can't go to grad school. Like, I didn't have either. But like, I got better at both in graduate school. And so, you know, I think like, I have a 4.0 in my grad school, you know, over like 6 years, and not because I'm a tryhard. Like I just, and I had a very bad GPA before. I've gotten way more confident in public speaking. So don't think about it as like, am I qualified to get there? Like, graduate school is learning those things. It's becoming a better student, a more confident student, and becoming a better speaker. So yeah, don't ever let those things discourage you from going, because there's a lot of training that you get. Like, that's why a PhD takes as long as it does. So are there other questions from folks in the audience?
As far as like, you guys all have like your own research that you do, right? Like on top of the lab. Did you guys come in knowing like really what, like a vague idea of what you wanted your research to be on, or is like the first year spent on finding that?
I'm glad you asked this question, because I wanted to kind of counter some things earlier where like I think it could definitely be good to come in knowing what you want to do. However, that was not my experience. So I mean, maybe I had somewhat of a vague idea, but my advisor's very flexible and was like, oh, you can just, you know, do whatever project you want. Whereas like, you know, some people, especially if they're coming in off of like a big funded grant, it's kind of already known in the beginning what they're going to be doing. So yeah, I was kind of like, I don't know, like I want to work with birds, but that's like, and like here's some, but I'm like, I could ask like a million questions or work with a million study systems. So I'm like, it was very overwhelming for me. However, I applied for a fellowship my first semester that was due in mid-October. So that forced me to figure out what I wanted to do real quick. So, and then also our program, you have to do a whole research plan by the end of your second semester. So that also forces you to figure out what you want to do. So, I mean, I would say I don't think you have to know exactly. I mean, like definitely if it's possible for you to try out a couple things ahead of time and know genuinely things you don't like and some things you do like and some things you're interested in. But also the project changes a lot for some people, maybe many people throughout your PhD. So you could come in thinking like, I really want to do this, and then it might change. So, you know, you don't want to be disappointed, be like so set on something because it might not work out.
Here's a tip. If you are starting and you've been accepted to a lab and you know like generally what you're interested in, so like I didn't know what I was going to do. I had frogs and I had bacteria, and these are just two nouns, right? Like it didn't really turn into a project or anything. So I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with that. But like one of the things that helped me work through stuff is one of the classes that I was in. There was a paper that I read that was like really cool, and I was like, I want to do this, but with these, because nobody has before. And so that helped. But something else that you can think about is just like skills or techniques, right? So if there's something that like you want to learn to do, like maybe you want to know how to like sequence a genome or something, then trying to work that into a project within that professor's lab is going to be a little bit easier than being like, I don't know, like birds, and they like fly, and we can do something with that. But if you're like, what I really want to do is go into something where I could work on a computer and like figure all this stuff out, then you might be like, okay, so genomes, and then maybe that turns into like differences in this population versus this population or something. So it's easier to branch off and find new ideas if you just know like general skills that you'd like to have, or if you want to do like more field work and learn how to do that stuff, then that can turn into projects as well compared to like laboratory stuff. So if you can't come up with a question initially, then try papers, and if that also doesn't work, then try techniques that you want to learn, and one of those should probably work.
So I'll ask a follow-up to our two master students, which I think my experience was kind of like I had a little bit like blinders on, that there was sort of like a project that I was specifically working on. So I don't know if you guys are able to speak to sort of like what that transition was like. Were you sort of coming up with your own questions, or was it sort of like you kind of already had some set pathway that you were on?
Yeah, I came in, like my advisor specifically was looking for someone for a USDA grant to fund. And so there's this invasive insect north of here, and everyone's kind of scrambling to figure out how to control it or manage it. And she's like, okay, you're going to look at repellents because no one else has done that. I'm like, okay, cool. And I like, chemistry in the vicinity of plant-insect interactions. Like, I love that stuff. And so she also told me that in addition to this research that you're definitely going to do, you can like sort of use that as a springboard, use this same organism or even a different insect or whatever to, come up with your own project. And I just got finished writing probably the same grant that you did, the GRFP. And that really kicked it into high gear of like, what am I actually going to do? Because I was thinking about, sequestration, which is how insects take plant metabolites and use it for their own defense. And I was able to sort of come up with something very solid for that. And now that's probably going to be my PhD project because I'm planning on staying here. So things can be really great. Yeah.
I was sort of in the same situation. So the project that I'm working on actually had some preliminary data attached to it, and it was already funded. And I knew what the project was going into it. When I was interviewing with my PI, she explained the project to me, and it was something that I was interested in. I had a broad overview interest in like mitosis and cells and things like that. And this project sort of coincided with that. I didn't have like a specific thing I specifically wanted to work on, so I was okay with this project that was almost being handed down to me. And with that, knowing that it is now my project, it can go many different ways. There are so many things that, because we're focusing on like a tumor microenvironment, and so there are so many different like aspects of a tumor microenvironment that can take this project into different things. And it also has an in vivo aspect that may be happening down the road, which is just in mice rather than like in cells. So there are a lot of different ways that it can be taken, and going further, just like it's now my project, so I can sort of dictate where the data takes me, and I can go in that direction.
Any other questions from folks? Yeah.
This is kind of pointed. So I am looking to apply for a PhD program here in the next month. And so you guys said a little bit about how getting a PhD versus a master's can limit you with your job opportunities. Can you expand on that, please?
I can do the basics. Okay. So a PhD typically puts you at like the highest position, like it's the ceiling, right? And when you're in that position, you're not usually doing a lot of the stuff that people like. So if you are, okay, fine. We'll work from the beginning.
We'll cut that out.
So let's say that you're like, what I really enjoy is working with marine life. Like that's your research thing, and you're doing that. So you go through grad school and you're like scuba diving every day, and you're getting samples, you're bringing them back to the lab and stuff. Once you establish your own lab, you don't have as much time to do that anymore. You now have to write grants to get the funding to do that. You have to monitor the grad students that you have that will be out doing that. maybe you have to hire like a postdoc. Yeah.
So you're speaking of like academic.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So in that sense, but also if you're doing like a government organization or something, that's going to be a lot of like management, not necessarily like you doing the science, if you will. Like it's often more of a managerial position. Now you can do like research. It's not like once you get a PhD, like you're just done and there's no opportunities for that. Things like startups usually have more of that you would be able to do, but you're sort of boxing yourself out from a lot of those things that they would get other people to do. Whereas with a master's degree, you can get that and the money, and it'll be a lot easier. There also seem to be more positions, at least currently, that are looking for people with master's degrees versus PhDs, which could change with this, more people are getting PhD things. But it does seem to be like a broader job market there versus the PhD thing. And then they don't want to pay for a PhD. It's too expensive, right? You're going to want a lot of money for the time that you spent doing that, and if they don't need it, then they don't want it.
That's especially true for government positions, because so it's cheaper for them to start you as a master's because you have to work through their pay grade, basically their pay system. So like if you come in as a PhD for this is the government specifically, they have to pay you a certain level. It's like it doesn't matter, a certain level. But if you come in as a master's, they get like many years out of you before you reach this higher tier kind of thing. So that's another thing to think about. Is it, like Corn said, it might just be easier to get some jobs as a master with coming in with a master's. Also, if you are at all interested in doing field work and that's like what you want to do, I almost guarantee you having a PhD completely precludes you from any jobs where you are every day out in the field doing stuff like that. It's a lot of managerial stuff at that point. So,
Yeah, you'll hear like you get priced out, and that basically is what you're describing. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah,
Or
I think you just touched on it, but what would be the difference between the work you're doing going into a career in research with a master's versus a PhD, like day-to-day stuff?
so I don't have a master's or a PhD actually, but I think it goes back to PhD. If you're coming in, you're getting hired as a PhD, you are expected to take on a lot more roles, and that, like, in academia, that includes mentoring students, applying for grants, starting up your own lab with your own study system, sort of thing. In a government job, it might be like overseeing your employees, which is sort of the same as mentoring students, but and running a lab in that way and dealing with other government. So I think, and I've never gotten a job with a master's, so, but I feel, based on people I've talked to, it's a lot of like, maybe you are a lab manager, and so you're kind of like the step down from the PI in your lab. So you're overseeing some things, but really you're there to do like a specific job. You're there to do research or do field work, or and you're not as burdened, I guess, with these other things that somebody with a PhD might have to do.
we probably have time for one more question if anyone has one, and then we'll sort of do our little close-up thing. Does anyone have?
I guess for like the GRE, how many of you have done that? And like,
Boo.
okay, because I was like, what if I run across this program that I really like and they want a GRE? Should I just go ahead and take it, or is that a waste of my time? It's expensive.
Don't do it. It's expensive. It does not correlate to anything about your success as a grad student. It says nothing. I would be hesitant of a department these days that still had it and still considered it. It's like the antithesis of inclusivity and promoting diversity, and listen, this could be another panel and I could be the single panelist on it.
Anybody else want to rail on the GRE?
The only thing, a quick counter to that is only like if there is a place that you really want to be, like you could find a professor, like Texas A&M job boards, you could find something, and if it requires you to submit your GRE, like that, you will not be considered for the position if you haven't done it. So like, even though I agree with that philosophically, you may find that you have to do it. And so I think like figure out specifically what you would want to do, look at those different schools and programs, and figure out sooner rather than later if you think you're going to have to take the GRE.
Also talk to the PI before you do, because they might have a way, if they really want you, they're going to get you. They don't care, like, if you're like, I don't want to take the GRE, they're going to be like, cool, we'll figure it out. Unless they can't, like Sam said. So, yeah, just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, if you find a department that like still requires it, and you end up interviewing with someone, and if you ask them why, like, I'd be very surprised if they could come up with a legitimate answer. It's really outdated at this point.
Well, on that high note, no. So we did want to just this last 5 or 10 minutes, we're just going to very quickly sort of go through and either to answer one of the following, and maybe Jesse, we'll start with you and work our way back. What is the best piece of advice you received about graduate school, or what is one thing you wish you knew before starting graduate school?
Well, I would say one thing which sounds a little bit snarky, but someone had said it to me, and I think it still holds true, that the best advice they ever heard about entering grad school was to get a good therapist. And I know that sounds really bad, but in a sense, I think the broader topic it's touching on is important in the sense that, yes, grad school can be challenging at times. You can have unexpected things, like, for example, the pandemic. In my case, also, my lab ended up moving from campus to Roanoke, which is about an hour away. And so sometimes there's things that you don't foresee happening and that you never really could have predicted, but you still have to deal with them. So if you can have a strong support network, and that kind of goes back to what we were saying about finding a program that's supportive of you in the lab, and an advisor who really matches your interests and your personality and just at you as a person. If you have a supportive environment for yourself, then it's much easier to navigate some of these challenges like the pandemic or whatever the case may be.
So it's one thing that we wish we were told, or sorry.
Either a piece of advice or something you wish you knew before starting.
Something that I was told that I thought was really good was to do as many different things as you can while you are in grad school. When you are in grad school, it's a really unique opportunity to really find out what is most important to you in your career, in your life. So really, if you can, you have time, and somebody asks you to do something that you've never done before that you think you could be interested in, definitely just do that. Like, take the time and try it. And if it sucks and you hate it, then that's fine. But if it's awesome and you love it, then that's another opportunity that you could possibly have as a future career. So I thought that was really insightful.
One thing that I wish I knew coming in here, and this is not in a bad light, but it is how all-consuming it can be, in a sense. For me, I am immersing myself in this literature. I'm learning every single day. I'm learning new things. I'm reading all the time. I go home and I dream about the lab, and I dream about what I'm reading. And it's just, my PI told me, she said she's originally from Italy, and so she said when she came here, when she was learning English, the first time she dreamt in English, she was like, I'm actually learning, and I'm taking in what I am learning, and I'm applying it to my life. And now I kind of think of, some people may think of dreaming about it and thinking about the lab all the time as like over consuming you and like being a stressful thing. But for me, I'm taking it as I'm learning and I'm doing what I wanted to do. And it's a little bit more freeing knowing that it's not a stress on me that I have all these things to do. It's me bettering myself for my future career.
It's really cool. Reading in English for the first time. I think best piece of advice, like, know more about like your motivations for going to grad school than like it's just something to do. I have a friend that I talk to pretty much every week that's also in a grad program, and we both say to each other, like, yeah, we just kind of started grad school because we didn't really know what to do and we like science. Like, I started this program because I like staring at bugs. Like, that was probably the best reason that I could come up with at the time. And so I consider myself lucky that I'm actually motivated enough to stay here and, search for what I really care about. Because I still do get to stare at bugs, but there's, more important things than just doing that. It's communicating what they're doing, why it's important, etc. So thinking about the broader impacts and the intellectual merit that you inside joke, sorry, that you will be spreading is really important.
Just so y'all know, that was really funny to us.
If it's ever applying for the NSF jersey, it'll be hilarious.
They're the National Science Foundation, the two things they consider.
Gotta put it on everything now. Advice that I would give you, right, is to find a way outside of the academic bubble. It's dark in here, and like people are stressed, but many of the things that people find stressful about like grad school and academia are actually just normal people problems. Like your boss wants you to work all the time. You have a project that's due at the end of the week, which is something that my friends in completely different fields have to deal with. And so when you're like stuck in the academic bubble and people are complaining about all of this stuff, it starts to get to you after a while and you're like, right, and it's terrible and there's nothing I can do. When like a quick phone call to somebody outside and you're like, this is the thing, and they're like, right on, yeah. Kind of being an adult, those are problems that everybody faces. I mean, like, there are some unique things to this, but just that lifeline to the outside, very important. And that's coming from somebody who, like, I want to be in academia. Like, that's my goal. But I'm going to keep that phone call just to be sure.
So one thing I wish that I would have done throughout my undergrad was make more of an effort, like, to get to know my professors. I went to a big university, so like going to office hours and stuff was always very intimidating. And, you didn't really get to know the professors because it's very large class sizes. And so this can be difficult when it comes to letters of recommendation. So you need, I think, like 3 letters of recommendation. So definitely start making those connections early on so that you can have people to write your letters. Or if you get research opportunities, those people can write your letters as well. But it can be tough to ask someone, especially if you take a break. So if you take a break, maintain connections with these folks. It's like, we did this research together like 2-3 years ago, and now I'm going to grad school. So it's a little more awkward if you haven't talked to them in like 2 years. Yeah, that is all.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I want to hand you the mic.
Well, and that's what I was going to say is like get letters of recommendation before you graduate. You will thank yourself. I think the other thing is that I had some advice in my master's from a professor that said, don't let your course, in a class that I was taking with him, don't let your coursework get in the way of your education. And I was just like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Like, I'm in your class. And the whole point is that like, it's a different mindset than undergraduate where like your research, the skills that you're developing, that's what's important. And like the coursework, you need to fulfill those requirements. Sometimes you can learn a new method or something, but it's just very different mindset. And so I think like if you have the opportunity to do undergraduate research, that's probably the closest thing to going to graduate school as you can have. And so, for those of you that are able to, I definitely would encourage that. I don't know, Amber was the organizer here, so I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or anything, but.
No, thanks so much for attending. And I don't know about anyone else, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit if people have questions just informally, or if you want my email or anyone else, if you have more questions that you think about. And yeah, that's all. So thanks.